Hello and welcome to Heilman Haver, the stage and screen podcast coming to you from Casa de Quinn at 1111 Studios in beautiful Port Orchard, Washington. I'm Greg Heilman.
And I'm Matt Haver. We're two local actors looking to hone our craft by exploring the best in local theater and on the big screen. Each week we bring you entertainment news and views, celebrate classic Hollywood, enjoy cocktails with a Tinseltown twist, interview talented local actors and directors, and chat with industry experts from LA to the UK.
Welcome to episode 62 and a very special interview with award-winning director, writer, producer, and playwright George Stevens Jr. Mr. Stevens' new book, My Place in the Sun, hits shelves May 17th, 2022. It's the story of how the son of a celebrated Hollywood director emerged from his father's shadow to claim his own place as a major force in American culture. Stevens tells an intimate and moving tale of his relationship with his Oscar-winning father and his own exciting career in Hollywood and our nation's capital. Fascinating people, priceless stories, and behind-the-scenes view of some of America's major cultural and political events grace this riveting memoir, again hitting shelves May 17th.
George Stevens Jr. is the founder of the American Film Institute, creator of the AFI Life Achievement Award and the Kennedy Center Honors, and has served as co-chair of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities for President Obama. His awards and honors include 15 Emmys, 8 Writers Guild Awards, 2 Peabody Awards, the Humanitas Prize, and in 2012, an Honorary Academy Award, the Oscar. He's the author of Conversations with the Great Moviemakers of America's Golden Age at the American Film Institute and the Broadway play, Thurgood. Mr. Stevens joins us from his home in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Well, thank you. Great to be with you. Thank you for the nice introduction.
Absolutely. Well, we were excited to spend some time this afternoon with you. Your life has been committed to the promotion and preservation of the performing arts. We've been enjoying your book. It's a fast-paced story. It's fun and easy to read, and just a ton of Hollywood history in there. You come from a long line of entertainers, all the way back to the San Francisco stage in the 19th century, to the silent film era, to Academy Award-winning films, like we talked about, your dad, Emmy Award-winning television programs, and of course your Broadway play. A story that I really enjoyed at the beginning of your book is about you starting off as a youth, very young, 1933, on one of the R Gang films and Wild Poses. Now, that's a story you say that you admit to not remembering, but maybe you can tell us what's your first showbiz memory going all the way back?
I guess I think the first one was I visited. I remember I had broken my arm. I'd fallen off of a double-decker bed. I must have been around 10 or maybe 11. And I remember going, maybe it's because I've seen a picture of it, but going to the RKO studio where my father was making a picture called Penny Serenade with Cary Grant and Irene Dunne.
Yeah.
I remember being on the set, and there was a train station and snow at the Columbia studio.
So, in your early life, you were brought up in this industry or in this environment, and I imagine that did you have a creative childhood as a result of being surrounded by this atmosphere?
What's interesting, Greg, we lived in Toluca Lake, which was in the valley, and it was kind of a little village, and with kind of normal people, except at the other end of the block lived a family called Crosby, a man named Bing with his 5 sons, and Amelia Earhart, the aviatrix, lived on Valley Spring Lane.
Wow.
And Al Jolson and Ruby Keeler had a house, and Bob Hope lived, but it didn't feel like show business. And my parents kind of kept me apart from it. And I did in school. I edited the school newspaper and the yearbook, and and I did have a creative bent. I think when I graduated from high school, my father had been away at war for 3 years and came back and made a picture called I Remember Mama. Then when I was graduating, I didn't have a job that summer. And he said, well, you can help me. So he gave me 2 assignments. One was to read the books that he was signed with Columbia. His company was at at Paramount Pictures. And so the books would come from Paramount. And my job was to read those and tell him what I thought of them and scripts. And the other was to break down Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy. My father was about to make a movie which ended up being called A Place in the Sun, that was based on Dreiser's two-part famous book. And so I had to outline every character, every scene in 2 notebooks because my father was about to work with the writers on the script. And the other was these books would come, and a lot of them were sort of kind of routine love stories, treacly love stories, which were not fascinating to a 17-year-old on hot summer afternoon. But one day, a book came. I remember it was a small book, a novel, and I read it in the afternoon. And I went that night. My father was in bed. He was reading, and I walked in with this book, and I said, "Dad," I said, "this is really a good story. I think you ought to read it." And he looked at me. He said, "Well, why don't you tell me the story?" So there I found myself pacing around his bed, trying to reconstruct in my mind the story of Shane as I'd read it in Jack Schaefer's novel that afternoon. And I realized, really in retrospect, in writing this book, that was obviously my father's way of letting me have a look and see if I had any aptitude or was I was interested in his racket, his profession. And so that was really how I got into it.
That'd be the equivalent of somebody, a mechanic who has a child, or getting that person to start to work on cars and things like that. Just you're getting under the hood, you're getting down and dirty into the details of the industry early on, which is, I imagine, probably has helped you through your life, because you've built a strong foundation around a lot of these.
Greg, that's a perfect analogy. In fact, in the book, I tell about when I was, I guess earlier, when I was about 12 years old. Dad had a 16 millimeter projector and a screen that you set up on tripod, and he would get 16 millimeter prints of his movies. And I learned to thread the projector and run them. And some were the Wheeler and Woolsey comedies, when it was starting out. But then one came that became my touchstone. And it was a film he made in 1939 called Gunga Din, with Victor McLaughlin, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and Cary Grant. Yep. Wonderful outdoor adventure. But it was also a film of considerable humanity and taste. And I would run that film. And I say in the book, that a chemist, a biologist kid might have a chemistry set, or as you say, a car, learn to work on cars. And I would watch those films, and I really became deeply touched. And also, my father made films about outsiders. I mean, Alice Adams, one of his early films, was about an outsider, a girl trying to make her way, poor girl. And Shane was an outsider, and Jet Rink and Giant was an outsider. And Gunga Din, this regimental beastie, the water boy who wanted to be a soldier and was kind of training and wanted to, and eventually saves the regiment. And at the end, when the music plays, and I just would love the scene when the colonel of the regiment at Gunga Din's funeral would say, "You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din." I was touched by that. And looking back, I realized that my taste in films kind of began with that one.
Something I really enjoyed was the correspondence that you included in your book between you and your father, the letters that you wrote, some that he wrote back to you, some that he wrote to your mother, some that he wrote to your grandmother while he was overseas, really documenting the war effort in Europe. And I just recently watched Five Came Back, the documentary, and that was really my introduction to a lot of your father's work. And they spoke of how the war effort, and especially documenting some of the war crimes towards the end, coming into Dachau, and I think you used the term, as they did in Five Came Back, he was now a collector of evidence. But his sentiment, his dedication to you and your mother, his character really came through in a lot of those letters, and I really appreciated that. You also wrote at well beyond your age. I was very impressed. Working in a school, you don't see correspondence like that from kids. But it was just a really an interesting look at him as a man and also as a professional. And I'm wondering if there are some other aspects of his character that you feel like he passed on to you and allowed you to interact with some of the biggest names over, your career in Hollywood, politics, pop culture. What are some things that he just really embedded in your character that allowed you to be so successful in those different realms?
Matt, that's a very good question, and you're, about his influence in the war and all. And again, I really discovered or examined that influence. And my father rarely gave instructions. I don't ever remember him telling me not to steal or to brush my teeth. Of course, he was away at war, but he educated by indirection and by example. And I particularly remember being on the set of Shane, which was my first experience up in Jackson Hole, with a big crew and all of the adversity that comes with movies, whether you're behind schedule. And he never raised his voice. I mean, sometimes with the bullhorn, he'd give instructions, but, when he talked to the actors before a scene, he'd want it very quiet. And finally, he'd just say, "All right, action," or if there was something wasn't right with the acting, he'd take one of the actors aside and have a conversation with him. And I just learned how a man without raising his voice could lead an army. And I think it helped me. And I also saw that he kind of had integrity and stood by his values. And, and I was always comfortable when having grown up and then worked, as as a directing Alfred Hitchcock and Peter Gunn, and working as the associate producer on The Diary of Anne Frank, thinking that my life was going to be directing and producing movies. I did sometimes sorrowfully say to myself, I'm going to spend my entire life working to become the second best film director in my family. But that changed when Edward R. Murrow came into my life and took me to Washington during the Kennedy years to head the motion picture division of USIA. And working under Ed Murrow, and being 29 years old in an agency where everyone was more senior than I, certainly all the leadership, I just was comfortable dealing with people. And I think it was just by observing my father, I knew how to do it.
Sounds like he did a lot of that with humor.
Yes. Yeah, Dad had a wonderful sense of humor. Now I'm going to fail to think of a joke. Your question, but he did. He had a light touch.
Speak softly and carry a big megaphone.
There you go.
So a question for you, George. So you mentioned kind of this bi-coastal experience in the industry from Hollywood back to DC. Obviously, there has to be a cultural difference, I would imagine, between the two coasts. Can you speak to that a little bit? Coming from this super creative, Hollywood atmosphere over to what would seem like stuffy Washington politics. Was there an adjustment there? What's your take on that?
It just kind of seemed natural, and through time, Hollywood and Washington became more like one another. As people in Washington became more public personalities, and conscious of that. And I tell you, about impressive people, and I've worked with so many, and people ask, well, who made the greatest impression? I was with Leonard Maltin, and he has his daughter now do his shows. And she said, what was that moment where the hair stood up on the back of your head when you saw a movie actor? And I said, I really can't think of that feeling, because when I saw Irene Dunne and Cary Grant, they were just people doing their work. And she was disappointed. And then a minute later, I said, I'll give you the answer, but it's a different one than you're going to expect. And it was when I arrived in Washington, I was single. And so I was an extra man. So I started getting invited to parties, and I get invited to a party at the R. Sargent Shriver's. That was Sergeant Shriver, who started the Peace Corps, married to Eunice Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's sister. Mm-hmm. And I have a little rented car, and I put on a tuxedo, and it's snow, and I don't know how to drive in the snow. And I drive out to the Shriver's house for this party for the person who was ambassador to Denmark and was marrying a friend. And I go to this house, and music is playing. There's a band. You go in, and all these people, and I see cabinet officers and senators. So here I am in this world, and the Kennedy administration was young and vibrant, and after dinner, the Shrivers had a kind of a circular entry hallway, and they passed drinks on trays after dinner, and I have a scotch in my hand and having a wonderful time seeing all these people in this kind of a circular group. And the front door felt like it blew open. And through the front door in black tie with no coat comes John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Wow.
And I'd never seen a president. And it was the days of black and white television. And he was in color. And behind him was Lyndon Johnson. They'd been to a stag dinner for the King of Saudi Arabia. And he was coming late to this dinner. And he walked into this room, and there were kind of two rows of us really in a circle. And he walked around and said hello, and, the smile, brushing his hair. And I was in the second row, and our eyes didn't meet, but I was in 4 feet of him. And he was just so, I guess if the hair goes back, and I don't remember that aspect, but it was just so impressive, and charming. And then just a few minutes later, I had been sitting with a man called Newton I. Minow, the Vast Wasteland speech. He was the head of the FCC. He was 36 years old. And I caught up with him a little later after Kennedy arrived. And I was talking to him, and he said to me, have you ever met the president? And I said, no, and continued talking. And I realized he wasn't looking, and I look over, and there's President Kennedy. Wow. And Minow says, he said, Mr. President, when I shut up, Mr. President, this is George Stevens Jr. He's come to work with. He says, I know about George. I have a question for you. He says, but first, Newt, he says, CBS made $250 million last year. Why can't they broadcast Jackie's tour of the White House show in color? And it was so typical of what you hear about President Kennedy, that he always had action on his mind, and would talk to the person. And well, it turned out that he wanted to talk to me about P2109, the film that was going to be made, but it never occurred to me that the president knew of my existence. So that's perhaps a bit long-winded, but a story of meeting somebody I was very impressed by.
That's right up there with everything I've heard about JFK, with his ability to know so much about everything and be informed. That just shows, talking about the CBS thing, knowing those sorts of details. What an amazing guy.
But you're right, Gary. And just playing off of what you just said, I made a film with Bruce Hershenson, a very good young director at the time, called The 5 Cities of June for USIA. My job was USIA. We made 300 documentaries a year to show overseas, telling America's story abroad. And the 5 Cities of June was of about 5 cities, the 5th being Berlin, where President Kennedy arrived to make his famous speech at the Berlin Wall in 1963. And it turned out to be a wonderful film, was nominated for Academy Award. It was and I was in Ed Murrow's staff meeting with all the directors of the agency, the foreign areas and all. And my assistant, my deputy, walked in with a note and handed it to me. And there's about 30 people at this long table. And I look at the note and I get up and walk down the stairs, one flight of stairs to my office, and walk into my office and shut the door. And my secretary is dialing back the call President Kennedy had called me. Wow. And I sit down and, and the phone rings. That's Mrs. Lincoln, his secretary, on line. I'll put the president on, Mr. Stevens. And he said, George, he said, The 5 Cities of June, I saw it last night. He said, I think that's the best government documentary I've ever seen. He said, how many countries is it being shown in? How many languages is it translated into? He just, and it was Kennedy's was known for not calling Dean Rusk, but calling the person on the Cambodia desk, because he wanted to get the straight thing, not, and so he called me, and then I hung up, and he'd asked to send the film back. They wanted to run it again that night, but it was extraordinary to have had that association, and he was a tremendous influence on me. As you see reading the book, I quote him frequently. And if
he was our first TV president, but he also, I understand, had a real appreciation for Hollywood. He enjoyed the movies. Did you ever have a conversation with him about any of the films, the entertainment films that he enjoyed? Did he screen films regularly in the White House?
He did. Jackie loved films. Jackie had, if I would not disrespect the president, you might say better taste, more expansive taste. She liked the foreign films and all. But I remember President Kennedy did ask me, I was in an event, why he said, did you see, the picture Marlon Brando made, not the Ugly American. Yeah, I guess it was The Ugly American, and about a diplomat in Asia. And he asked me about that, and he was not too enthusiastic about it, but interested in it. But President Kennedy, when I started the Kennedy Center Honors, which, if you know, was and wrote and produced it, co-produced it for 37 years, where we honor the great performing artists. And that was the idea at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, which is John Kennedy's memorial. We would honor usually 5 great artists from all the different disciplines each year. But when I had the idea to do that, I went down to see the head of the Kennedy Center, and my pitch was one sentence. I said, carved on the wall in marble on this memorial to President Kennedy, the Kennedy Center, are these words: I look forward to an America that will not be afraid of grace and beauty, that will honor achievement in the arts the way we honor achievement in business and statecraft. The words of President Kennedy, just so elevating, inspiring, that, led me to create a television show that's still going on,
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Now, you say that, the number of documentaries you made for the government, it's just, through the roof, an incredible amount. Now, someone who had made a number of government documentaries a little while before that, Walt Disney, did during World War II. Did you ever have any interactions with him as a in the industry?
Well, no, but I had interactions with Frank Capra, who did that. Like my father was a colonel in the Army, the Why We Fight series. And my father made documentaries, as Matt was referring to. So I knew the history, but when I went to Washington, I was very conscious of that. I love the story in the book when, like my father, Frank Capra liked control of his pictures. And Frank Capra was a man not of much height. And he came to a meeting at the Pentagon, and there were 14 generals, and he meets them all, and they've all got their fruit salad on their chests, and he's shaking hands and all. And there's this long table, and then finally it kind of quiets down, and Frank, standing much shorter than all these generals, he says, fellas, he says, are we going to talk about motion pictures? And they all nod. He says, then I'll sit at the head of the table. And that was sort of, I had that feeling about what I was doing at USIA, hopefully not with arrogance, but that I really felt we needed to control the kind of films we were making. And I found a lot of young filmmakers. We couldn't call back John Huston and Frank Capra and George Stevens and William Wyler, but we found young people in their 20s and 30s who were really just ready to make the kind of fine films that we were able to make at USIA.
I was struck again watching like Five Came Back and other documentary type information or films and programs about specifically that generation of filmmakers. Your father's generation was again, especially during the war effort, their ability to jump from making fiction to nonfiction, and that's kind of seamless move. And I'm wondering, from your perspective as a storyteller, as a documentary storyteller, you also have a stepdaughter, Caroline, who's a documentary producer.
Right.
What do you think is the most important element to consider when you're telling a true story on film?
Well, I think two things. You want to, Mal, can I tell you a story about making a film?
You bet.
November 1963, shortly after that phone call I described with President Kennedy, he's shot in Dallas. And, you can imagine how earth-shaking it was, particularly the people who were involved. And I was in Washington at the time. And I had to think, what am I supposed to do at USIA? And I thought about it, and I asked to see Edward R. Murrow the next morning. And I went to see him, and I had an idea about a documentary film. And as I sat down, Ed had his lung removed. He was a great smoker, as you know, and he was just back from the hospital. And Ed never sat behind his desk when you went in to see him. He always went over to the sofa and sat opposite you as equals. I sat down, and he handed me a letter. And, we had not said anything about what had happened. What did he say? And I looked at this letter, and it was a White House letterhead, and it said, Dear Ed. He said, I think I'm so glad to hear that you're back, and we've missed you, and it's so important that you're back with us. He said, I saw the 5 Cities of June, and I don't think there's ever been a better government documentary, and I salute you for that. And looking forward to seeing you soon. Signed, Jack. And here I'm holding this letter that was in his hands 8 days before. And I handed the letter back to Ed, and Ed pushed the letter back to me, and he said, you made the film, you keep the letter. Wow. And of course I have the letter, and that tells you something about Ed Murrow. But then I told him my idea. I said, we have cameramen in 7 different cities abroad with 35 millimeter film shooting the reaction to President Kennedy's death. We intend to shoot the 4 days of the funeral and weave within it the story of his presidency into a documentary feature-length film, the first USIA feature-length film. And I watched Ed, and he listened, and he said to me, first, he said, make a 10-minute film about Lyndon Johnson. And understanding what the job was to show that there had been a peaceful transfer of power, and that he said, then you can make your film about President Kennedy. But it was the wisdom of the more experienced man against the kind of exuberance and, letting his heart lead his head, making the film of President Kennedy. But we went on to make went on to make both of those films, filming LBJ in the Oval Office and Gregory Peck narrating the film. The light in the White House window flickered, but it did not go out. And then the John F. Kennedy Years of Lightning, Day of Drums was a very successful documentary. And the process is to make the story compelling and to have integrity and be true to the facts.
That's one thing that you don't see a lot of these days. Matt was talking about the ability to jump back and forth between fiction and nonfiction. You don't really see that these days. You see documentarians, documentary filmmakers, and feature film, drama, comedy, that sort of thing. But you don't see them really jumping back and forth all that often. And I wonder if that's has to do with the state of the industry or the ability of filmmakers, if as they're coming up and learning, if they just have decided to do one, kind of niche thing, and they don't dare step across the aisle to the other. What do you think about that? Do you think it's an industry thing, or do you think it's more of a choice from these filmmakers?
I think it's to a large measure it's a choice, but many of them do. I mean, I think of Billy Friedkin, and through the years, many of the leading filmmakers have come from documentaries, but not too many of them go back to documentaries. Although occasionally one or the other, Marty Scorsese makes a documentary now and then. I
was just going to say, I think the ones I think of sticks out in my mind is Michael Moore. Makes a ton of documentaries, but also made Canadian Bacon, which is a very funny film. Yeah. Definitely not a documentary, but yeah. So I guess to your point, yeah, there are some instances out there. It just doesn't seem as prevalent, and it could be a money thing too, because documentaries don't make the money that a lot of the other regular films do.
I think that's true too. Yeah.
Well, we have some mutual friends. I was glad to read in your book about your friendship with Robert Wagner. We did not know Robert, obviously, but we do know his biographer, Scott Eyman, another great author we've enjoyed having on the show. Got some folks down at TCM that you've interacted with recently. You were down in Hollywood alongside Steven Spielberg, another guy who knows his way around around directing, to present the 4K remastered screening of your dad's film Giants. James Dean, Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson got him an Oscar for Best Director. What can filmmakers and directors of today learn from that movie, or maybe your father's style in general? Do you think that Giant can be made today and have the same impact it did?
Well, it's interesting. We screened it, as you mentioned, at the TCM Festival, which is a great gathering.
Yeah.
And Stephen and I introduced it at Grauman's Chinese, no longer called Grauman's, but the Chinese Theater, with an IMAX screen. Now, it is the same theater where we premiered it 65 years ago.
Wow.
And with a full house, with this wonderful restoration that Stephen initiated. He called me and said, your father's film Giant is a masterpiece. It can be improved. There's some deterioration of the dissolves. I don't want to get, and anyway, we did this absolutely magnificent remastering of it in 4K. And to watch that film all this time later. And it plays like it did the day it opened, and audiences see it, on a big screen like that. And it's different than seeing it on television.
Oh, yeah.
I did a book signing for My Place in the Sun the next day, and there's this amazing turnout at 11 o'clock the next morning, and most of them had been at the screening and were so impressed, they said, by the conversation with Stephen and me, in which we talked about values of filmmaking. And one that I mentioned, that I was young, just out of the Air Force editing, when my father was editing the film, and it's a 3 hour and 20-minute film that does not feel like it. It's just so beautifully constructed. But and I kind of got in, and we kept refining it. And I said, Dad, God, this picture, we just had a preview. It plays so well. Don't you think we should just put it out? And he kept working and changing a close up here and tightening this up and changing the music a little bit. And he said, think about how many hours people are going to spend watching this film. He said, don't you think it's a good idea if we spend a little more of our time right now making it as good as we can, so it's better for all of those hours,
Always thinking of the audience.
And that was, you pick up on it, Matt. When those days around the studio heads often referred to the audience, having the mentality of 12 or 14-year-old, and my father, you ask what I learned from him, is respect for the audience. He always said, trust the audience, give them something to think about. Don't put it all out there, leave some work for them. And you saw that in Giant, just how it plays the same as it did. And to see it again with laughter, there's a great deal of humor in Giant, and to feel that laughter with an audience is and the other, my father believed in the test of time. You have time for one other story?
You bet.
Oh, yeah.
When he made A Place in the Sun, Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor, we went together to the Academy Awards. I think it was 1951. And I was, I guess, in my late teens. And I sat next to my father. We'd come with my mother and his actor mother. And Joseph Mankiewicz, a fine director, Oscar winner, came out on the stage to announce the nominations for Best Director. And he said, John Huston, African Queen, William Wyler, The Desperate Hours, Vincent Minnelli, An American in Paris, Elia Kazan, A Streetcar Named Desire, and George Stevens, A Place in the Sun. Well, it was A Place in the Sun. I wouldn't be telling the story. Riding home in the car, and I was a young person, and I don't know why, but I excited or too excited about it, but for whatever reason, my father, the Oscar was on the seat between us, and he looked over and he said to me, we'll have a better idea what kind of a film this is in about 25 years.
Wow.
He was talking about the test of time. And this is before DVDs or, film festivals or streaming, that he, kind of coming from the theater, you guys are actors, he knew that the value was how things last. He loved Eugene O'Neill. And so 25 years, we just had to release the 70th anniversary Blu-ray of A Place in the Sun. But he had that idea, and that's an important theme of my book, The Test of Time, because he did not know that he was talking at that time to the future head of the American Film Institute, who would be preserving America's films.
What a legacy.
The American Film Institute is just one of your your many accomplishments. I mean, you've been awarded 15 Emmys, 8 Writers Guild Awards, 2 Peabody Awards, the Humanitas Prize, and the 2012 Honorary Academy Award, in addition to founding the American Film Institute and things like that. Is there one accomplishment in your career that you feel most proud of?
Well, gosh, I'm blessed with a lot of things that warm my heart. Yeah, I think it may be the film I made about my father in 1984. I made really one of the first films about a filmmaker. And it was called George Stevens. It is called George Stevens, A Filmmaker's Journey. It's available on Criterion from time to time and on Warner. You can get DVDs from Warner Brothers. But making that film about my father was, and it worked out so well. I narrated it and had interviews with Katharine Hepburn and all of the wonderful actors he worked with, and I'm really very proud of it. And you see it today, and it's, if I do say so, people say to me, Warren Beatty just in a conversation last week said, I think it's the best film about a filmmaker there is. And it was a little bit of my effort to meet his test of time about a person very important to me.
Well, before we let you go, this has been an absolute pleasure. We could talk all night, easily into the wee morning hours, I'm sure. But you've got dinner plans, and we so appreciate the time you spent with us. It's been a real thrill for us. Before we let you go, what's your favorite story in the book? Do you have one story that maybe got the ball rolling when it came to, maybe I should start writing this stuff down? Is there one that stands out to you?
Gosh.
It's only 90 years in almost every, film era and no pressure.
I'll just pick one. I don't know. And it relates to the previous. One of the most satisfying things I've done, and you were also asking who I treasured working with, was working with Sidney Poitier. And in the 90s, I came upon or read about the Brown versus Board of Education decision about eliminating segregation in public schools. And I wrote a script, and I took it to CBS and said, well, this is really a great story, but you're not going to be able to cast it. And I said, well, I haven't really thought about that. Well, I said, well, what about Sidney Poitier? And they said, kind of ruefully, oh, they said, well, we've been going to Sidney for 15 years. He won't do television. And if you could get Sidney to say he'll read the script, we'll pay for it. Well, I went to see Sidney, and I told him what I wanted to do. And I said, I know you don't do television, but it takes this time to tell this story. And Sidney said to me, well, I have great respect for Thurgood Marshall. And if you come to me with a compelling script, I'll do it. So I went off to write a compelling script, knowing that it all depended on one person, and only one person on the planet saying yes. And Sidney said yes, and we did it together. And it was called Separate but Equal. Also, Burt Lancaster played the role of the other attorney, which was part of the Supreme Court, part of the case. And it won the Emmy for the best miniseries. And working with Sidney was just such a treasured experience that I would, and this too is a film that it does not shown widely enough, but it really tells that story of the end of legal segregation in American schools.
Well, what a wonderful story in a book full of wonderful stories. George Stevens Jr., your new book is My Place in the Sun. It'll be available everywhere fine books are sold May 17th, just a couple of days away. Mr. Stevens, it's been an absolute pleasure. We wish you best of luck with the book. Are you going to be going on tour, doing any book signings?
We're doing a number of things, book tours. We're going to Tom Brokaw is introducing me at the 92nd Street Y in New York, that wonderful venue on June 5th. And Michael Beschloss is going to lead a discussion, the great historian at Politics and Prose in Washington, on May 17th, the publication date, which coincidentally, the publication date is the date of the Brown versus the Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court.
Nice.
May 17th. So there's a little poetry there.
Well,
Sure.
lots to celebrate, and just a wonderful time we've had this afternoon with you, Mr. Stevens. Thank you for your time, and we hope to cross paths again soon.
Me too. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much.